Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Samantha Piet, and I'm a Marketing Communications Associate here at the Commonwealth Purchasing Group. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our program, we are the leading group purchasing organization for community health centers and other nonprofit organizations. I encourage you to visit our website, cwpurchasing.com, to learn more about how we can help your organization save money. Today, we are very excited to have Annette Cooke, president of ZD Coach, here today to talk to us about succession planning. Let me tell you a little bit about Zurick Davis before I introduce our presenter. Zurick Davis is a retained search firm that recruits exceptional executives and physician leaders for healthcare organizations of all types. To complement their core business, they have developed 2 additional areas of expertise that many organizations require: coaching for new executives and their teams, and recruiting interim leaders to serve while the search is being conducted. To learn more, visit zurickdavis.com. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter, a native of the United Kingdom. Annette works with a portfolio of clients as a leader of executive and physician leadership searches. Annette is a Coactive Professional Certified Coach, CPCC, and is accredited with the International Coaching Federation, ICF, as a certified executive coach. As a member of the senior leadership team, Annette brings 20 years of experience in healthcare executive search, working in both the US and internationally. Her expertise includes working with large, complex academic medical centers as well as hospital systems, where she is responsible for maintaining the effective client relationships. Prior to joining Zurick Davis, Annette worked for a boutique search firm in Europe, where she managed an international division, recruiting executives, nurses, and allied health professionals, working primarily in South Africa and Ireland. In addition to her work expertise, today's webinar is designed for 30 minutes for the presentation portion and 10 minutes for the question and answer period. If you have a question, please type it into the chat and I will share it with Annette after her presentation has concluded. At this time, I'd like to hand it over to Annette. Thanks so much for joining us today, and why don't we get started?
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. Thanks for that really nice introduction. So hello, everybody. As Stephanie mentioned, my name is Annette Cooke, and I'm a Senior Vice President at Zurick Davis and founder and president of our coaching division. Just before we get started, there's a housekeeping slide somewhere, but the housekeeping slide is, if you can't hear me, please dial back in or check your audio settings. And if you'd like to ask a question, then type it in the Q&A or the chat box. And if you want to minimize the control panel, click on the white arrow in the small orange box. And to maximize the control panel, please click the arrow. So as Stephanie mentioned, we are a retained search firm and we're partners to CPG in that we work with community health centers in an effort to recruit your mission-driven leaders. And as a search firm, we're often asked to work with client organizations such as yours as they embark on either a new leadership search or as a standalone succession planning engagement. We do use a myriad of tools and methodologies during succession planning, and some of those we will discuss today. So what I'm hoping today will provide you with a framework of succession planning and why it's becoming more imperative for organizations across the board. We're talking about the community health center world in this instance, and the importance of you in terms of your resources and serving our most vulnerable, and why you really can't, you cannot afford not to have a plan for succession, especially given our current environment of quiet quitting, hybrid work, healthcare frontline workers and executives, fleeing the industry. You've probably seen the Forbes article, since 2020, 1.7 million have quit the healthcare industry. So there's a lot to consider as we start thinking about what's succession planning and what it is. So let's talk about what it is. So it's not a new concept. Its origins date back to Henri Fayol. He was born in 1841, and he was a French pioneer of management history. It was his idea to develop the concept of universal organizational planning. However, in terms of the US, it's commonly believed that it was really more adopted in the 1970s, initially by General Electric, and they were an early adopter of the concept and the idea. So since then, you know, succession planning has been adopted in some form by many corporations, but it's not as prevalent in the healthcare industry. Progressive healthcare systems, you know, over the past probably decade have begun to explore and adopt the idea for their organizations. And put simply, succession planning takes a snapshot of the organization to determine the overall health, and in order to identify potential successors for key leadership positions. While it can be applied to non-leadership roles, it is mostly applicable in the leadership ranks, which is really what our focus is today. And the most important aspect to remember when you're thinking about succession planning is that it is a process. While the process evaluates the organization at a specific moment in time, it should be used continuously in order for it to be truly effective. Just like an employee's performance evaluation, this is not a one-time event. It is ongoing, and it's a continuous evolution. That is when it's executed, you know, correctly. Why is it important? Well, talent shortages, turnover, retirements at community health centres, the baby boomer generation. Many of them were founders of the community health centre movement, makes proper planning a necessity, really, rather than a luxury, right? Failure to plan can cause a leadership gap, which can be expensive. The financial cost, of course, you know, is a huge concern to community health centres where money needs to be managed carefully. But we also need to recognise the impact on other resources, such as your people. If your CHC cannot afford an interim, then it's likely another senior leader may be asked to take on additional responsibilities. And in my experience working with health centres, the senior leadership team, they're already strapped and managing much more than their fair share of work. So that works only in the short term. Not to mention, we've seen what has happened in burnout in the past couple of years. And given the war on talent, you know, a CEO, CFO, COO search, for example, can take easily 3 to 4 months, probably closer to 4 months. And if you're looking at a chief medical officer search, it can be longer, it can be up to 6 months. So in those instances, how do you ensure your organisation is well prepared for the absence of a leader? You know, you can plan for it via a formal succession planning exercise. A couple of weeks ago, I was listening to Satya Nadella. He's the CEO of Microsoft, and he was being interviewed about his position. You know, he's a tenured CEO at Microsoft. He's been at the company for 20 years. And he was talking about succession planning. And succession planning at Microsoft is an annual event. So it's not like he's going anywhere tomorrow, but every year at a board retreat, they talk about the succession planning and what is going to be important when he departs the organization. So if we look at a best practice model, it's about identifying. So it's an informative overview of the current state of your talent pipeline with a glance into looming talent gaps. And we'll take a look at that in a moment. It's an investment in development in terms of your most valued employees, especially those at the leadership levels. And it's about retaining talent too, right? It's important. But preserving organizational knowledge is really even more paramount. Understanding an organization's history and knowing its unwritten rules, those cultural nuances, and effectively navigating its complexities, they all take time to learn. So a well thought out transition allows time to ensure an effective and really seamless transfer of this kind of organizational knowledge. So there's two types of succession planning. There's organizational and there is position specific. And we'll take a look at both of them in terms of a quick glance. So let's take a look next at what effective succession planning actually looks like. So again, we talked about it's an informative overview of the current state. It's an investment in development and it's about retaining talent. What succession planning isn't, it isn't what is on the screen, right? It's not a way to reward hardworking employees. It's not a one-time event. It's not a one-size-fits-all, and it's not a solution for poor leadership. It's a dynamic process that works exceptionally well if you're willing to invest the resources and time to do it properly. It's sort of like when I think of a search, right? A search is a verb. It's not a one-time event. It's a tried and true process that works if we do it properly and follow the steps that ultimately yield success. And it's the same for succession planning. It contains many moving parts and should evolve as your organization evolves. So we've all seen this, right? The Peter Drucker culture eats strategy for breakfast. And let's talk about that and how it relates to succession planning. So strategic succession planning is an approach that we've created at ZD to develop a succession plan anchored to organizational culture. In addition to assessing the existing talent, we conduct a deep dive into the organizational culture. And the product of that is a succession plan that not only addresses the leadership pipeline for mission critical positions, but also considers the unique needs of the organization and its culture. Here's how we've deployed it. The ZD team interviews key organizational leaders one-on-one, and that's to gather information, including assessing the organizational culture, identifying key leadership competencies for the future, and sizing up the internal talent pipeline. We collaborate then with the client to determine the appropriate organizational levels for the interviews. Each interview is conducted in a prescribed format to ensure consistency of data, and the privacy and confidentiality of our one-on-one interviews often yields really rich information that generally does not emerge during sort of an internal facilitated roundtable group sort of meeting. And most importantly, you know, as third party shareholders, stakeholders, it's our objectivity that ensures that the organizational analysis is valid, comprehensive, and also candid. If the pipeline shows gaps for key positions, then external hires are equally a viable option, and we can tailor research to meet that organization's needs. What I'd like to do now, and this is just the way we look at it, right? There are 8 stages. There are some tools that have 6 stages, but let's take a look at these 8 stages. So if we look at number 1, define organizational needs and goals. That's about understanding the strategic objectives of the organization. It's about identifying critical roles and key positions that require succession planning. And then it's determining the skills, competencies, and attributes needed for the future success in those positions. Number 2, we establish a process to identify the high potentials, right? That's really important. We consider performance, leadership capabilities, and the potential for growth, and then create a talent pool of succession candidate lists for each position. Number 3, we assess and develop successors, and we do this by conducting assessments, some of which are interviews and some of them are actually psychometric tools, to evaluate potential successors against predefined criteria. We utilise tools like performance evaluations, assessment centres, competency-based interviews, and then we identify development needs and create individual talent plans and development plans for each successor. We look at number 4, that's about monitoring. So it's about communication here, clearly communicating the importance of the succession planning to all stakeholders, engage managers, leaders, and the potential successors in the process, and then provide feedback and guidance to them about the development progress. And finally, it's about instituting a, culture of continuous learning and development. So we move on to what does it look like to create the pipeline of successors, and that's different levels within the organisation. Of course, we're talking about leadership today, and that's what's most important. But it's about really, understanding who the future leaders are. Then we move on, and it focuses on really establishing a really clear process for transitioning successors into vacant roles. And this is, of course, organisationally, providing support and guidance during the transition period and monitoring and evaluating the performance of successors in their new positions. And finally, you come around to retention, right? It's about establishing a clear process for transitioning successors into vacant roles, providing the support and guidance, monitoring and evaluating, again, the performance of the new successor, and then refining and improving the succession planning model based on all the lessons learned. And that is, specific to your organisation. It's not a one-size-fits-all. If we want to take a look at the position specific, and remember we talked about the position specific and then organisational. So many of the same rules of best practice apply when you're conducting a position-specific organisational planning engagement. What makes it different is in the how in which it occurs. We're looking to replace a key leader. So we do want to review the organisational needs, and that will likely include your strategic plan, as well as perhaps an assessment of the leadership team in place. That's important because to understand what the next leader looks like, we first need to understand the culture. What type of person thrives best? Why? What has the outgoing leader accomplished? What have they done to elevate the organisation? What is the roadmap moving forward? What do you want your organisation to look like in 5 years? When we conduct a search, which almost certainly requires some level of succession planning, we always make the client aware that we want to hire for the future state of their CHC, not what you have today. Considering that future state is really critical when you think about succession planning, because you're not hiring again for today, you're hiring for sort of what you want your organisation to look like. So I've got a couple of, examples that we've worked on. We had an outgoing CEO who was very transparent about their retirement, had a very solid legacy, well respected and tenured, and asked CD to find his successor. And so what he wanted was a COO who would become a CEO within 2 years. So knowing this, you're seeking an individual who's best suited to working for a CEO, but can also assume the position as the CEO fades into retirement. We did place an exceptional operations leader whose growth area was around strategy. And so with mentorship and coaching, they were able to meet the goals outlined by ZD and the CEO. And this really resulted in a very seamless transition that was effective and without any disruption to the senior leadership team. Another example, which I'll give you, which is a little bit different, but gives you a nice contrast, was a startup company in health tech. And the CEO was very comfortable in operations. And even though they were the CEO, they continued to revert to operational initiatives versus being the external face of the company. They knew that they were not fulfilling their role as CEO, not at least holistically. So they asked CD to conduct an assessment around whether they should become the CEO or have us recruit a COO for them. Through a formal assessment, we were able to help the CEO understand their gaps, right? They needed to first acknowledge what their gaps were, coach them through those gaps, and help them become the CEO that the company actually needed at that time. That was all while I recruited a COO. simultaneously. So while you might not think that's not technically, succession planning, it's just another way of looking at your organization strategically and figuring out where there are leadership gaps and how you might consider a solution. And you want to do that proactively versus reactively. So when we look at, the organizational aspect of succession planning, we covered it in detail a few slides back. But how this works, it's usually led by, HR, that's typical. And it is a significant undertaking that requires identifying those high potentials and then walking them through a methodology to assess their current capabilities. And after that initial assessment, which is helping them really understand the structure in which their leadership gaps and leadership skills can be honed to expand that knowledge. We start from the ground up, and often, you're looking at somebody's 360. You can follow it up with, something, a more formal assessment, maybe something along the lines of Hogan leadership, or my personal favorite, the EQ 2.0, really, really successful instrument that helps you see very clearly where somebody is on the leadership bar. It's scored 0 to 125, 100 being sort of the average, a little bit like an IQ score. And then once you get into sort of the 115, 120, you're in the leadership bar there. But there are many more instruments. I mean, that's just a few. But it's usually from there that we can follow kind of the steps outlined earlier to make sure that there's a successful outcome. Let's talk a little bit about the pitfalls. So if you don't have a succession plan, right, we've talked about the imminent need, why it's important. And, I can see you might be thinking, well, this is great for bigger organizations, or, we don't need it, we're small, we can figure it out. But the truth is that lots of things happen if you don't have a really well thought out plan in place. There's very rarely one heir apparent for a key leadership role, such as a CEO. As senior level, people age, or when there's an unexpected departure, there are almost, always several individuals who want to be considered. We've seen colleagues engage in, unpleasant competitive behaviour, and factions emerge within organisations. All of this impacts the organisation negatively, right? The organisation and its culture. We know change is difficult for everybody, but gaps in senior leadership, especially at the C-suite, signal potential change in a direction to most employees. This can cause concern and is not openly expressed in many instances, right? It's around, gossiping and people being fearful. And when they feel, when employees feel that the work environment may be negatively impacted, they could seek stability elsewhere. When you think about your key stakeholders at a CHC, physicians are front and centre, and like employees, they crave organisation stability. Their relationships are important to them. And as a leadership change, threatens to impact the balance, they may have an even stronger stake than staff employees when it comes to the long-term direction for the organisation. Their practice environment, their reputation and revenue streams are tied directly to the health and success of your organisation. If physicians sense trouble on the horizon, they may seek to move, and that could result in them taking patients with them to a stronger or more stable competitor. So there are some pitfalls here to really think about if you don't have a good plan in place. So let's just take a quick moment to look at the key takeaways. We've covered a lot. I hope you've gleaned some valuable insight into the case for succession planning, its benefits and pitfalls, and learned a little bit about the approach we call strategic succession planning. So in summary, it's to preserve organisational knowledge, leadership continuity and culture. And traditional succession planning has been around for some time, and it has value for organisations. It offers multiple benefits, including a strong tie to organisational culture. And we have, a acquisition of carefully selected external talent when necessary to immediately address the critical gaps or shore up the internal pipeline. And there I will wrap it up. And I know we're running low on time because of my technical difficulties. I apologize. But if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Hello, this is Samantha from CPG. I have a couple of questions that have come in, one of which says, please repeat the name of the tool to assess leadership capacity, and that was on slide 14.
Yes, so there are several tools. Two, I think, of the best available. One is called Hogan Leadership, and the other is called the EQ 2.0. I'm certified in both of those tools. I think they are excellent tools to assess leadership. My personal favorite is the EQ 2.0, but quite honestly, both of them are exceptional tools.
Great, thank you so much. Another question, as a small organization, what is the average cost we could expect for this type of service?
It really depends on, I can't give you a number, but it really depends on what it is that you're looking for. If you're looking for something position specific, then it's going to be much less expensive than if you're looking at something organizationally, of course. When we conduct a search, there is a limited amount of succession planning we do as part of the search, but we also do standalone, as I said earlier, and it really just does depend. What I would say is, think about what you're paying your strategy consultants. It won't be as much as that. Let me put it like that. I think we've done some engagements for, you know, several $1,000s, and then we've done bigger engagements for much more money than that. So it's hard to give you a number without knowing exactly what you're talking about, but I would say, you know, people will always try and work with you within your budget. If you come with a scope, you can scope out that, you know, that scope of work can be priced out, and then it can be adjusted to meet your budget. Most good succession planning experts will work with you around what you can do. It will just depend on what it is that you want. And yeah, without understanding exactly what it is you need, it's hard to answer the question with a dollar amount.
Okay. Thank you so much for that answer. Another question that came in was, what is the most important consideration as we think about succession planning?
It's transparency. You know, be transparent with the team, with your team, about, you know, communication transparency, right? So communicate what it is that you're doing. Let people know. Once people know there's a plan, and you communicate and you're open about it, you will absolutely be fine. Your organization will likely remain stable. If it is stable already, it will stay stable. I think what happens is if you're not transparent and you're not communicating what is going on, that's when people start getting nervous.
Okay, thank you so much. And then the very last question is, what is the average time frame for succession planning from start to finish?
Again, that is highly dependent on whether you're doing organizational or position specific. If you're doing position specific, it literally could be a few weeks. Organizationally, it's a multi-month effort. But if you're looking, for example, to replace your CEO, that could be 2 to 4 weeks of work, and then a report generated on the back of that.
Great, thank you so much. I don't see any other questions have come in. For those of you who would like more information, Annette's information is right here on the screen, and you will also be receiving an email with a link to this recorded presentation as well. Thank you so much, Annette. I definitely learned a lot, and I know that our audience did as well.
Thank you, Stephanie.
You're welcome. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.